Hello all, I am back once again, and well, after Kuriko last week, I can safely say at the start of this week I had nothing more on my mind than this. Must watch more sports anime! Before my last video went up, this one was at the time the only sports show on my recommendations list, and is also something I'd heard a good amount about beforehand. Thus, without any further ado, I present to you a review of Hajime no Ippo, otherwise known as Fighting Spirit in the US, which is a 75 episode shonen sports series about boxing, based off of the manga of the same name by George Morikawa. It aired between 2000 and 2002, was produced by the studio Madhouse, written by Tatsuhiko Urahata, and directed by Satoshi Nishimura. Unlike with last week's basketball, I went into this thing with a little bit of prior experience in boxing, but only from, you know, watching the Rocky films or sitting in the corner of the room as a child whilst my dad yelled at real boxers on the telly. The tale at hand, though, is a coming-of-age story about our protagonist Makinochi Ippo and his journey through the world of professional boxing. At the inception of this tale, Ippo is a responsible yet shy young lad who has worked hard helping his mother's fishing business ever since his father passed away many moons ago. He's been bullied his entire life until one day a passing boxer by the name of Takamura Mamoru steps in and shakes off Ippo's assailants. Ippo is so taken aback by this man's strength that he becomes inspired to pursue boxing himself, not for the purposes of getting revenge on these bullies, but to try and find the true meaning behind what it means to be strong. After a few trials from Takamura, Ippo joins Kamigawa Gym, steps into the ring against his first rival, and from here on until the end of the series, the story revolves around, well, boxing. Lots and lots of boxing, and it was bloody brilliant. The first thing I commended this story for when it started up was Ippo's motivations in becoming a boxer, as every time I've consumed fiction with a bully protagonist before, the first thing on their mind has always been getting revenge. It's this point that made me realise that anime about boxing is able to tap into the best of both the sports and battle shonen genres, as you're able to have all of the greatness of combat alongside the competitive rivalries of sport. If this were simply a battle series, then revenge would absolutely have been the first thing on Ippo's agenda, but instead boxing was to become something for him to dedicate his life to, and something for him to be passionate about. And this passion really did show once this thing actually got into its first full boxing match. These things were so intense and hyped up, and the most amazing thing about all of them for me was that they were all completely different. Ippo fights about 12 matches or so across the length of the series, and I can remember each one in detail just because they had such unique and interesting structures to them. This is of course down to the incredible variance of the opponents Ippo faces, but even when it came down to facing the same opponent for a second time, the match still had great unique and standout feelings to it. This led to something I couldn't have been happier with, in that all of these fights were so incredibly unpredictable, but not in a who is going to win sort of way. A lot of the time you could telegraph who is going to come out on top simply because of how it would affect the flow of the narrative, but as far as what went down inside the matches, it always had me on edge until the victor was decided. Whenever special moves were used, or this thing broke into hilarious minute-long sequences of internal dialogue whilst the fist was slowly moving towards someone's face, it was so immensely entertaining and I enjoyed almost every moment of it. The only things I didn't like in the fights were when they broke away from the tension to show a flashback or random outside the arena sequence, as it completely wrecked the pace that had been built up in the fight for me. This wasn't even the case every time it happened though, as there were occasions where this was done exceptionally well, but for the most part they felt poorly timed and I wasn't a fan. Then after each match was over, we always had a brief cooldown period involving lots of "You got punched a bunch, you need to rest now, young grasshopper," and this led into an introduction into who was going to be fought next, and a superbly executed build-up and training sequence before the next fight came to pass. And this training was done so well as it felt really legitimate. You got a genuine feeling that Ippo was giving his all and improving with each passing minute of the episode. Sure, it broke into your classic Rocky style training montages, but these work great in this kind of show, even if they can be done so poorly a lot of the time. The most brilliant thing linking these training sequences to the fights themselves though is that it felt like the series was never faffing around. Everything that happened was relevant, and the only things that weren't were portions of brilliantly stupid comedy, which were just like fart jokes and vulgar obscenity for the most part, but it worked so well with the personas of the main characters surrounding Ippo. But this comedy was only there when it needed to be and never took away from the meat of the story at hand. Another thing I really commend this for greatly is how clearly it shows both the life outside of boxing and the dangers and effects boxing can have on those involved. Everyone felt human in this regard, and each time someone stepped away from a ring you understood their life was just shortened by the brutality they had just gone through. And all the characters had such well developed backstories that you genuinely cared if they were going to receive a horrible injury that might end their career, even if it was one of the antagonists. They always connected with the reality outside of the ring, and at all times throughout the 75 episodes were always building upwards and onwards to what was going to happen next. In other words, it were right good. I've already mentioned several times about how well developed just about every character was, and each and every one of them had a very necessary role to fill in the story. Within Kamigawa Gym at the start, we of course have Takamura, who was Ippo's idol that brought him into the boxing world, and is an all-round incredibly strong, arrogant, and hilariously vulgar dude. He's often accompanied by the other two main boxers of the gym, Aoki and Kimura, who regularly serve as a comedy duo with their antics together, but also had many of their own important individual traits that gave them brilliant roles. Then the crazy cat who serves as Ippo's opening rival goes by the name of Miyata Ichiro, with such a brilliant wall of calm technique and power to get Ippo's head in the game from the get-go. But sadly, I felt his character as a whole was very poorly utilised later in the series, but the reasons why are in spoiler territory, so I'll leave it at that. The final main chap in the gym, who serves a very important role before we move on to Ippo himself, is the founder and head coach, Kamigawa Genji. This dude is an old veteran who sternly guides and trains Ippo through each step of his boxing career. He's a very firm and strict trainer, but cares greatly about the welfare of his boxers at the same time. He was such an integral part of what gave this show its great flowing storyline and a driving force in what made Ippo, well, Ippo. So yeah. Ippo. He starts out as many shonen protagonists in coming-of-age stories tend to. He's this shy and timid kid and was absolutely a prime target for bullying when he had such clear weakness. But as the story goes on and Ippo grows, he still remains a shy and timid guy, but instead of weakness, he has unrivaled courage and willpower that drives him forwards. It's this combination of character traits that leads him to go into every fight as the underdog and makes him someone designed to be rooted for, and you genuinely do want to. He's a passionate character who never gives up, and in this kind of story, that's a perfect role to put in the protagonist slot. Oh, and he has a ginormous willy. Yeah, so animation is what I talk about next. Yes, so this thing had some really well designed characters first and foremost, with some of the rivals coming across truly intimidating or just really cool wherever they needed to be because of it. Then each of the core group of main characters had an appearance perfectly matching their role and everyone was delightfully memorable because of this. Then remember last week when I said this, I don't like line shading? Turns out I was wrong because it's done a bucket load in this series, but I really dug it this time for some reason. And I think it may be down to this thing using lines a lot as a kind of visual style in several areas. So like it was used for the shading, for things like bruises, for conveying motion, really well I must add, and for stuff like sweat as well. It did look odd on some occasions though, and as pointed out to me by the person who recommended I watch this thing, it looked really bad on this chap with a beard. When you've got a dude whose beard, bruises, facial shading and motion are all done with identical lines, it looks like someone's been drawing on him with crayons and you could barely tell what was going on his chops. Aside from this, the animation on this thing was pretty delightful, and though there were some still frames and repeated sequences here and there, it was very nice to look at even if it is over 10 years old now. I don't like repeated animation. It was generally very consistent when it came to really intense moments in fights, and it was truly able to be visually mind-blowing. Audio! So let's talk music. This show had a really kind of rigid and rustic soundtrack for the scenes outside of the ring, and I really did quite like it. It used a lot of interesting guitar tones and felt pretty perfect when matched against these characters' lives surrounding boxing. Then when it came to getting into the ring, these guitars stuck around, but with great distortion and fast-paced aggression that gets your heart pumping as much as the great visuals do. I was really into this soundtrack, mainly because of this rustic sound it had. It was so different to what I'm used to, and though it was prone to reusing its fight music in every match, it really didn't lose its impact and was rather great. Don't like reusing music. Shut up last week, me. There was a brilliantly recorded array of sound effects in this thing, with the depth and tone of each hit of the boxing glove having a necessary feeling of force behind it that made the pain the characters got from each punch that much more real. And to cap things off, the voice acting was pretty much baller. Had a lot of great and over-the-top shouting of, I must punch the other guy! You need to punch the other guy! I need to punch, punch, punch! And those moments where they were giving a short novel's worth of dialogue in the time it takes for someone to move their 100-mile-an-hour punch a couple of inches had a great sense of panic and urgency to them. There were great varied performances from the characters who never got into the ring too, and thus, no complaints from me. Thumb. Though this show was 75 episodes long, it really didn't feel like it. It was so immersive and incredibly well paced that I just kind of sat there, and before I knew it, I'd watched all of it. I'm really loving sports anime right now, and this one was damn good. Thus, I shall be plonking a muscular 85% rating on Hajime no Ippo, and I would highly recommend it to any fans of the genre who have yet to see it. This thing was at one time distributed in the US by Juneon Entertainment, but due to their demise is long out of print and very hard to get hold of for a reasonable price. Thumb down. So, have you seen this show? If so, what did you think of it? And as always, like, subscribe, and feel free to drop me a recommendation of what you want me to review next. The spring season is drawing to a close, and thus it'll soon be time to review some of those new tasty biscuits. So until that time, see you next week. Oh no! A punch! I must dodge this punch! I need to use everything I've ever learned ever to come up with a way that may lead to a method in which I may come up with a method or way to dodge this punch!